Buenos días, tardes, noches a todos los que siguen su canal de Cristiano Moderno. Hoy vamos a ver a Flavio Josefo, la guerra judía, tomo 1, capítulo 8 en inglés. Hoy la transmisión será en inglés. Today's transmission will be in English. We're going to look at Jewish War, Volume 1, Chapter 8, written by Flavius Josephus. Excuse me. Today's transmission will be in English. First of all, who's Flavius Josephus? Why is it important to study him? Well, anybody and everybody who is interested in seriously knowing about Bible history and about the events that shaped the Bible needs to know about Flavius Josephus and to be very familiarized with his writings. Here is why. When the Old Testament ends, it ends in a very drastically different situation as when the New Testament begins. Take, for example, in Catholic Bibles, the New Testament ends with the fight for the Maccabees to worship freely in their own land in 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And it addresses the victory of Judas Maccabee over Antiochus IV, Antiochus Epiphanes. But this happens in the year 164 BC. It tells us the beginning of the fall of the Greek Empire. Just barely the beginning of it looks at the very beginning of the collapse of the Greek Empire. Still almost 2 centuries before the rise of Rome, of the Roman Empire. By the time the Old Testament in the Catholic Bible ends, it is barely the year 164 BC. The Jews are fighting the Greek Empire. But all of a sudden, we turn the page and we start the New Testament, and whoa! Now we don't have Judas Maccabee as ruler anymore. You have Herod the Great. Well, there's 164 years difference right there. What happened between Antiochus Epiphanes IV and King Herod? What happened between the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire? How did one fall? How did the other rise? To properly understand the Bible, we need to understand this. That's 164 years of gaps. If you don't understand what happened between 164 BC and the time the New Testament comes about, you will not understand what is actually going on in the Gospels. Now, if we take the Protestant Bible, we take the King James Version, for example. The King James Version ends with Ezekiel, barely the middle of the Persian Empire, even further back in time, around 433. Now, it doesn't even get to see the rise of the Greek Empire. So that's another 250 years further behind. Another 250 years missing in the Protestant Bibles. So another 250 years that the King James doesn't have because they decided to take that part of history away. Another 250 years of history that the Protestant church took out because they wanted to keep you ignorant of the facts that brought about the rise of the Roman Empire. What if the Catholic Bible has problems figuring out what happened between 164 BC to the time of Jesus, and it's only 164 years gap? Now you have the gap is twice as big if you're looking at a Protestant Bible like King James. Because of that, any person who is seriously interested in knowing about the Bible needs to be very familiar with the works of Flavius Josephus, who was an early historian of Judaism. Actually, he was a contemporary of Jesus Christ as well. He lived during the 1st century and actually died pretty much about the same year the Apostle John did, about the year 100. Now, Flavius Josephus lived firsthand Jewish history, and his family is very connected because his family is connected to the Maccabean dynasty, also known as the Hasmonean dynasty. And he also participated in the war between Rome and Jerusalem around the time of the close of that Jewish Roman war that culminated with the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70. Now, Flavius Josephus, having lived both he and his family close to the events, give us a very important account of how the Maccabean Empire that was started by the Maccabees in books of 1st and 2nd Maccabees to the rise of Rome. Since the Protestants don't even have the book of Maccabees, they are at a loss to know what historically really happened, because they don't have the full contents of history in the Bible, because they chose to eliminate certain parts to keep you ignorant. But Flavius Josephus helps fill in those gaps. We're going to look at that right now. We've been looking at it. This is our 8th installment. We have been seeing some a few months back. Every few days, every couple of months, I do a new chapter in it for us to be learning. Now, as for the last time we spoke about this, and we saw chapter 7, we saw that the great-grandson of the Maccabees, what was his name? Alexander Jannaeus. He had 2 kids, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, who were busy fighting over who would be the next ruler, the next king of Jerusalem. And we saw that this fight was such problematic that one of them, Aristobulus II, went to the Parthians, to the Nabateans, another word for Arabs, for help against the Roman Empire and for assistance in helping him be elevated to the throne, while Hyrcanus II, Aristobulus' brother, went to the Romans for help. And we saw then that the battle was won by the Romans, and the general, who was then named governor of Syria by the Romans, arrested Aristobulus II, his wife, and his children, and took them as prisoners to Rome. But in that time, there was one of the children of Aristobulus II got away from the Romans and hid for a while. Let's see what Flavius Josephus tells us about what happened after that. So we're going to continue from chapter 8. Join me in reading along with what Flavius Josephus wrote in respect to this. And here we go. We are reading book 1, chapter 8. Alexander, the son of Aristobulus, who ran away from Pompey, Remember, it was Pompey who was a general also. Makes an expedition against Hyrcanus, but being overcome by Maccabees, he delivers up the fortress to him. After this, Aristobulus escapes from Rome and gathers an army together, but being beaten by the Romans, he is brought back to Rome with other things relating to Gabinus and Crassus and Cassius. So this tells us about a decade or so, almost 2 decades of wartime. Let's begin. In the meantime, Scaurus made an expedition to Arabia. We are talking about the year 58 BC. You see, Scaurus goes into Arabia because the Nabateans are supporting the rival. They're supporting Aristobulus II, who has been named an enemy of the state by Rome. However, he laid waste the country of about Pella, though even there he was under great hardship, for his army was afflicted with famine. So you see what's going on. Rome is trying to help Hyrcanus II to stay in power, because Aristobulus II has gotten the help of the Arabs, also known as the Nabateans, to overthrow Hyrcanus II. However, there is a famine at this time, and the soldiers that Scaurus is leading are weak. In order to supply which one, Hyrcanus afforded him some assistance and sent him provisions by the means of Antipater, whom also Scaurus sent to Aretas, as one well acquainted with him, to induce him to pay him money to buy his peace. In other words, and this Antipater here turns out to be the father of Herod the Great, who becomes king in about, 18 years later. But because of the famine, Scaurus and Aretas was the king of the Arabs, the king of the Nabateans. Because of the famine, they decide to establish some kind of peace, at least while they get a chance to strengthen both. Both Aretas and Scaurus knew that they were not in a position to continue fighting with such weak army because of the malnutrition caused by the famine they were experiencing. Now, Antipater was the mediator here. You see, Antipater had a lot of influence with both the Arabs and the Romans. He was well liked by both groups. The king of Arabia, that is Aretas, complied with the proposal and gave him 300 talents, upon which Scaurus drew his army out of Arabia. So we see now, after this peace agreement, Scaurus leaves Arabia. And this situation, which happened in the year 58 BC, is seen by many Romans as a big loss, because they could have won if their soldiers would not have been too weak because of the famine. But as for Alexander, that son of Aristobulus, who ran away from Pompey, in some time he got a considerable band of men together and a heavy upon Hyrcanus and overran Judea, and was likely to return him quickly. So Aristobulus II, remember, he was taken captive to Rome along with his wife and his children. One of his children, which was Alexander, escapes. And he gathers an army. According to some figures, he had about 11,500 men in his army. And they decide to attack Judea. Why are they attacking Judea? They want, remember that his father, Aristobulus, was fighting against Hyrcanus for the throne. Now, Aristobulus and Hyrcanus were siblings. They were both brothers of Alexander Jannaeus. And this Alexander, who happens to be the grandson of Alexander Jannaeus, is trying to, since his father cannot continue fighting against Hyrcanus, now he takes upon the fight and decides to fight against his own uncle, Hyrcanus II. And, well, he was being successful for a time, because one thing, though, that history does tell us is that Hyrcanus II was not very savvy when it comes to politics. He was able to stay in power only because of the Roman Empire's support for his presence in Jerusalem. But what prevented Alexander from taking over? Let's see. And had ventured to rebuild the wall, was overthrown down by Pompey, and Maccabees, who was a successor to Scaurus in Syria, showed his bravery as in many other points. So we see what's going on here. Now, Scaurus is no longer in power. Now we see that Alexander is attacking several areas of Judea. That is the region around Jerusalem. Now, this happens in about the year 57, more or less. Yes, on the year 57. 1 year later, after the treaty between Aretas, king of the Nabateans, and Scaurus. That was also the last year Scaurus was governing Syria. Because of this loss, he was recalled by the Romans, and in his place, Gabinus was established in power. 1 year after Gabinus rises to power, Alexander starts attacking Judea. And it is this Gabinus who decides to confront Alexander and put a stop to his attacks. He goes on to say, as in many other points, so in making expedition against Alexander, who as he was afraid that he would attack him, so he got together a large army composed of 10,000 armed footmen and 1,500 horsemen. He also built walls around proper places in Alexandrium, Hyrcanium, Machaerus, that lay upon the mountains of Arabia. Now, why Arabia? We see that now that Alexander, who was trying to get rid of Hyrcanus II, he goes over there. Where is he now? He is in Machaerus, in Arabia, the land that belongs to the Nabateans, the Arabs. Why there? Because remember that the Arabs, the Nabateans, supported his father, Aristobulus II, in the fight against Hyrcanus. So Alexander left to the company of former allies to be helped. However, Gabinus sent before him Marcus Antoninus and followed himself with his whole army. So we see now Gabinus is attacking Alexander, even in the territory marked by that belonged to Aretas, with whom Roma had a previous deal. But that deal broke off the moment the Nabateans decided to accept Alexander, because now they are harboring an enemy of the state, according to the way Gabinus sees it. He also had a young soldier among his people who later on became a very influential person, but he is barely making himself known. Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony. Yes, the same Mark Antony who fought against Octavian, which we will talk about in a few more sessions. Now, Mark Antony goes in representation of Gabinus to confront Alexander. This is one of the ways Mark Antony starts making his name known. Yes, this is the same Mark Antony who 15 years later falls in love with, what's her name? Cleopatra. But for a select body of soldiers that were about Antipater, this is the father of Herod the Great. So now you have Herod's father. Herod is still very small at this point. Actually, Herod wasn't even born. Actually, yeah, he was very small. Antipater joins Mark Antony in the fight against Alexander. And they take the advantage that the Jews did not like Alexander in power. He continues telling us, and another body of Jews under the command of Malchus and Pistolaus, these joined themselves in captains that were about Mark Antony and met Alexander. So Malchus, Pistolaus joined Mark Antony's army to fight Alexander. Towards the body came Wabinus with his main army soon afterwards. So Wabinus joins Alexander to fight the Romans. Alexander was not able to sustain the charge of the enemy forces. Now they were joined. He retired. So Gabinus's soldiers, led by Mark Antony, defeat Alexander's forces, even though Alexander had the support of Wabinus. So Alexander retreats. But when he was come near to Jerusalem, he was forced to fight and knocked 6,000 men in battle. 3,000 of them fell down dead, and 3,000 were taken alive. So he fled with the remainder to Alexandria. You see, imagine this. You have 11,000 soldiers. You have 11,000 soldiers in your army. And you're going over here and then all of a sudden they're forcing you to fight. Well, of course, you started the war, you lost the war, but now you're trying to run away. But they intercept you and you have to fight to defend yourself now. And out of 11,000 soldiers, you lose 3,000 who were killed, leaving you with just 8,000. And another 3,000 were taken captive, leaving you with just 5,000. So right off the bat, Alexander's army was cut in half. He loses 25% of his men, and the other 25% were arrested by the Roman powers. So this marks the beginning of the end of the Maccabean power. This is the part where we see how Rome is getting stronger, and the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, are getting weaker. Remember, I asked you in the beginning, how is it that in the Old Testament, in the Catholic Bible, we are at the point where the Maccabees get power, and then we have Rome in the beginning of the New Testament. Here we're seeing how that happens. The great-great-grandson of the Maccabees mentioned in the book of Maccabees in the Catholic Bible now start fighting amongst themselves, and this opens a way for the Romans to step in, and we have very important people like Mark Antony, Gabinius, Aretas, all participating in this. Oh, and Antipater, all taking place in this. And if this Antipater happens to be the person who later on becomes the father of Herod the Great. Now we see how the Maccabees that were getting power at the end of the Old Testament disappear from the picture, and the Romans are in full control at the beginning of the New Testament. Let's continue seeing. Paragraph 4. Now, when Gabinus was come near to Alexandrium, remember, why is Gabinus attacking Alexandrium? Alexandrium happens to be the fortress that Alexander built for himself. So Gabinus is attacking Alexandrium because he wants to trap Alexander. Because he found a great many there encamped, he tried by promising them pardon for their former offenses, to induce them to come over him before he came to fight. You see, Gabinus is trying to give the Jews an escape route. Gabinius tells the Jews, come, turn yourselves in, and we will forgive your life. Lay down your weapons, you can go home freely. But Alexander and his men say, no, they say, we want to be in control here. Those who were led by Alexander refused the terms of peace that Mark Antony was giving them. Foolish Alexander, he could have joined, he could have lived longer if he would have accepted those terms, because Alexander had already lost, but he refused to admit that he had lost. This was the problem with Alexander: arrogance. He had already lost half of his army, but he still wants to fight. Mark Antony, knowing that Alexander's army was chopped in half, was giving him a chance to save face, but Alexander refused. Now, Mark Antony, their leader, signalized himself in this battle. That means this is where Mark Antony starts being distinguished because of this battle that's about to take place. He was always showed a great courage. So he never show it so much as now. Before this, Mark Antony did not have the opportunity to fight to make himself known. Now he has a chance to make a name for himself. So did he never show it so much as now. But Gabinius, leaving forces to take the citadel, went away himself and settled the cities that had been demolished and rebuilt those that had been destroyed. So while Gabinius sends Mark Antony to attack what's left of Alexander's forces, he goes on and starts rebuilding the cities that Alexander's people had destroyed. And he tells us here some names: Scythopolis, Samaria, Anthenan, Apollonia, Yamnia, Raphia, Mariasa, Adoreus, and Gamala, and Astor, and many others. You see these places that were named they typically are associated with those who are opposed to Israel and support the enemies of Israel. Even today, we see the word Raphia there, which is where much of the Gazans of war is taking place. Well, a great number of men readily ran to each of them and became their inhabitants. So when Gabinius has rebuilt these cities, you had a lot of people who ran to these cities: Jamnia, Raphia, Mariasa, Adoreus, Gamala, Apollonia, Samaria. And they ran there to remake their lives. When Gabinius had taken care of their cities, or he had rebuilt them, he returned to Alexandrium and pressed on the siege. So Gabinius now rejoins the fight. So Gabinius goes, rebuilds the cities, comes back, and the fight between Mark Antony and Alexander is still taking place. But now Alexandrium, the fortress that Alexander had built, is under attack. It's under siege. You have Mark Antony's people and Gabinius' people surrounding it. So when Alexander despaired of ever obtaining the government, he sent ambassadors to him and prayed him to forgive what he had offended in him, and gave up to him the remaining fortresses, Hyrcanus, Maccabees, as he put Alexandrium into his hands afterwards. So Alexander, okay, notice what's going on. Mark Antony offered peace to Alexander and his people. Alexander and his people refused. So they laid siege to Alexandrium, Alexander's fortress. Now, Alexander sees that he has no way of getting out. So now he is trying to get the peace that he has rejected the year before. Which Gabinius is demolished. So Gabinius goes and destroys Hyrcanus and Maccabees, the other fortresses that Alexander used for his support. And the persuasion of Alexander was that they might not be receptacles of men in a second war. So Alexander's mother, who happened to be a prisoner in Rome, sent through certain messengers, gets Gabinus to be merciful towards Alexander's persons and not injure him. Let's see what else we see here. She was now there in order to mollify Gabinius out of her concern for her relations that were captive at Rome, which were her husband, that would be Aristobulus, and her other children. After this, Gabinius brought Hyrcanus to Jerusalem and committed the care of the temple to him in order to be that the other political government to be by an aristocracy. So Gabinius decides to name Hyrcanus high priest. Gabinius decides not to let anybody else sit on the throne of Jerusalem, not even a descendant of the Maccabees like Hyrcanus was. Instead, he decides that a ruler, a king friendly to Rome, was to lead in Jerusalem. However, he decided to name, to get the support of the Jews, he decided to name Hyrcanus high priest of the temple in Jerusalem. But it was yet to be decided who was to be the king in Jerusalem. This is why in the book of Revelation it tells us that the kings of the world prostituted themselves to Rome, not to the Roman Church, which did not exist yet at this time. At the time of Antipater and these fights, it is talking about the Roman Empire, which we see is right now with full power to take the throne away from Aristobulus II and to give it to whoever they want. Hyrcanus II knew this, that's why he invited Rome to help him. However, Rome betrayed Hyrcanus by deciding, you're not going to sit on the throne, you're going to help me as high priest, but you're not going to sit on the throne. We see Alexander decided to become king in Jerusalem, but since he was not friendly to Rome, Rome did not allow him to, though by inheritance, it was his right. Let's continue. He also parted the whole nation into 5 conventions. In other words, 5 different districts. The entire area of Israel was split into 5 districts. Jerusalem, which ruled Judea, Gadara, which ruled the area around Mount Hermon, today southern Syria. Another dance would be Amathus, about the 4th to Jericho, which is the region around the Dead Sea, and to the 5th division was allotted Sepphoris, a city of Galilee. So the area Amathus, I'm assuming, was around the region of Samaria, and Sepphoris, which is about an hour's walk from Nazareth, was to govern the region around Galilee. So the people were glad to be thus freed from monarchical government and were governed for the future by all aristocracy. So they were tired of being ruled by the corrupt offspring of the Maccabees. The first 3 generations of Maccabees, they were all right. But on the 4th generation of the Maccabees, starting with John Hyrcanus I, everything started becoming more and more corrupt. Yet did Aristobulus afford another foundation for new disturbances. So here's the problem now. Aristobulus, who was a prisoner in Rome, escapes. He fled away from Rome and got together again with many of the Jews that were desirous of a change, such as had been born in affection to him of old. So now, Aristobulus II who was taken a slave to Rome, escapes, gathers his forces. Alexander finds out and starts gathering an army to support his father, and they come to Jerusalem to try and fight against Hyrcanus II and against the troops of Gabinus. And when he had taken Alexandrium in the first place, he attempted to build a wall about it. But as soon as Gabinus had sent an army against him under Siscuria and Mark Antony and Servilius, he was aware of it and retreated to Machaerus. So Alexander, trying to prepare himself for the fight in support of his father Aristobulus, he starts fortifying his fortresses. However, Gabinus prevents this by attacking Alexandrium, Alexander's main fortress, and then Alexander flees across the border into Machaerus, which was a fortress right in the border between Nabatea or Arabia and the Roman Empire, or Judea in this case. For the unprofitable multitude, he dismissed them and only marched on with those that were armed, being to the number of 8,000, among whom was Pistoleus, who had been the lieutenant at Jerusalem, but deserted to Aristobulus. So Pistoleus, who had fought alongside with Gabinus and Mark Antony, betrayed the Romans and switches over to Aristobulus. So the Romans followed him, and when it came to a battle, Aristobulus' party for a long time fought courageously. So they were holding their own at first, but at length they were overborne by the Romans. So the Romans eventually defeat them, and of the 5,000 fell down dead, and about 2,000 fled to a certain little hill. But the 1,000 that remained with Aristobulus break through the Roman army and marched to Machaerus. So Aristobulus' people were intercepted, they fought, they managed to escape and continue on to Machaerus. And when the king had lodged the first night upon its ruins, he was in the hopes of raising another army. In the war, if the war would but cease for a while. Accordingly, he fortified that stronghold, though it was done after poor manner. So the king happens to be not the real king, but the person who was claiming to be king. This was Aristobulus. Aristobulus and Alexander meet together at Machaerus. They try to fortify it, but they do it incorrectly. But the Romans, falling upon them, he resisted even beyond his abilities for 2 days, and then was taken and brought prisoner to Gabinus with Antigonus his son, who had fled together with him from Rome. And from Gabinus he was carried to Rome again. Look at what's going on. Alexander escapes first. He tries not once but twice to get power over Jerusalem, fails both times, and he's forced to sign a peace treaty. Then Aristobulus and Antigonus, his other son, escape, and they join forces. Now you have Aristobulus, Antigonus, and Alexander joining forces. Even though, before being taken captive, both Aristobulus, I'm talking about his two children, Alexander and Antigonus, were fighting over the throne, but now they're fighting together against Rome. They resisted for 2 days, and then what happens? They lose the war, they get trapped again, and they're taken prisoner all over again. So now Alexander, who managed to avoid being trapped, now gets trapped along with his brother Antigonus and his father Aristobulus. Wherefore the Senate put him under confinement, but returned his children back to Judea, because Gabinus informed them by letters that he had promised Aristobulus' mother to do so for her delivering the fortress up to him. So Aristobulus' mother decides to come up with some agreement that in exchange for the fortresses, the lives of Aristobulus, Antigonus, and Alexander would be respected. But now, as Gabinus was marching to the war against the Parthians, he was hindered by Ptolemy. We're talking about Ptolemy the 13th here. Yes, that Ptolemy, the relative of Cleopatra. You see now what's coming here, right? So Ptolemy, remember that who received who was the prize made to? It was made to Aristobulus' mother. Aristobulus' mother was a Salome who was very influential in Egypt, where Ptolemy the 13th had ruled. So now you have Alexander and Antigonus pretty much reigning freely in Egypt, while Gabinus is getting ready to fight the Parthians. Gabinus is crossing over the Euphrates to arrive into Parthia to fight. Alexander sees his chance, and problems ensue. Where was I? From Euphrates. He was hindered by Ptolemy. So Ptolemy interfered so that Gabinus couldn't fight against the Parthians by releasing Alexander and company to be able to attack what was left of Gabinus' people in Judea, thinking that since Gabinus had gone over to fight, that there would be no defense. But Gabinus finds out and he returns. So it tells us upon his return from the Euphrates, he brought back into Egypt, making use of Hyrcanus and Antipater to provide everything that was necessary for his expedition. So he comes back from the Euphrates to confront Alexander and the people that Alexander had from Ptolemy's army. Antipater, Herod's father, joins in the fight. Hyrcanus helps him financially. For Antipater furnished him with money and weapons and corn. So Antipater, Herod's father, fed the army and auxiliaries, that means troops. He also prevailed with the Jews that were there and guarded avenues at Pelusium to let them pass. But now, upon Gabinius' absence, the other part of Syria was in motion, and Alexander, the son of Aristobulus, brought the Jews to revolt again. So now, a new civil war develops in Israel. Those that were able to be influenced by Hyrcanus and Antipater in support of Rome, and those who were under Alexander, obviously in support of Alexander. So there's a civil war that's going on. Accordingly, he got together a very great army and set about killing all the Romans that were in the country. Hereupon Gabinus was afraid, for he was come back already out of Egypt and obliged to come back quickly by these tumults. So now, Gabinus comes back trying to set peace in Judea and Samaria. But at this time, Alexander's people were already killing anybody they saw with a Roman uniform. Gabinus did not feel ready for that, and he becomes a bit afraid of it. He comes back thinking he was going to be able to set peace, but he did not realize that during all this time that Alexander was in Egypt, he was able to get the support of Ptolemy and a few men. He comes with what was left of his army and part of Ptolemy's army, probably some members of the Nabatean forces as well. So now Alexander's forces are bigger. They're able to resist a bit more. So Gabinius wasn't prepared for how much support Alexander got. However, he sent Antipater, who prevailed with some of the revolters, to be quiet. So Gabinus told Antipater to help calm down some of the problems that were occurring throughout this land. However, 30,000 still continued with Alexander. Notice there's 30,000. So Alexander's army is now 3 times bigger than he was before, who was himself eager to fight also. Accordingly, Gabinius went out to fight. When the Jews met him, and as a battle fought near Mount Tabor, 10,000 of them were slain, and the rest of the multitude dispersed themselves. Okay, so Alexander started out with 10,000, of which he lost a half and was only left with about 5,000. He is able to get another 25,000 thanks to Aretas, to Ptolemy, and a few other Jews who were living in Egypt who joined forces. So now his army increases from 5,000 to 30,000. It increases 6 times as much. But now Alexander's army goes into Mount Tabor, which is in the region of Galilee, and there the battle takes place. The Romans, led by Gabinius, Antipater, and a few other Roman supporters, Mark Antony, they still win. Out of the 30,000 that Alexander had, they lose 10,000. Last time they only lost 6,000. Now this time they lost 10,000. Yeah, upon seeing that 10,000 of Alexander's people died that day, the other 20,000 decided to run away. So Gabinius came to Jerusalem and settled the government as Antipater would have it. So Gabinius came back to Jerusalem and decided to let Antipater establish the government. Gabinius comes around and says, we cannot leave this area alone anymore. We have Alexander's people and all these people causing problems. We need somebody here to keep them in check. So Antipater says, I know. I'll take care of it for you. And who is this Antipater? Well, he is known because of his most famous son, Herod. Yes, that Herod the Great, who tried to kill Jesus in Bethlehem, remember? We are talking about his father here. So now Herod's father, Antipater, is placed in control of Jerusalem. From there, Gabinius marched and fought and beat the Nabateans, as from Mithridates and Osanes, who fled out of Parthia. So the Nabateans were getting some help from the Parthians. Now we see how was it possible for Alexander's army to grow so much. We had Alexander's people, we had Ptolemy's people, you have the Aretas' people, and you had the Parthians there. That's 4 or 5 countries supporting Alexander. But these 4 or 5 countries, though united in trying to defeat Gabinius and his people, they were not united in any other form because different nationalities, different languages, and so on. So we see that 2 rulers of the Nabatean kingdom, 2 people who have been in position to inherit the throne, Mithridates and Osanes, run away to Parthia. He sent them away privately, but gave it out among the soldiers that they had run away. Look at the politics behind this. Gabinius captures them, tells Mithridates and Osanes, you may go. Get out of my land. You're not welcome here. And then he tells the Roman, oh, go get them. They're running away. What do you think is going to happen? That's pretty much kind of a death sentence, a low-handed death sentence. In the meantime, Crassus came as successor of Gabinius. So now Gabinius is no longer ruler in Syria. It is now the year 54 BC. Gabinius is sent to govern in another part because he was so famous here. Gabinius' services are needed summer, so they bring Crassus over. The year is now 54 BC. He took away all the rest of the gold belonging to the temple in Jerusalem in order to furnish himself for the expedition against the Parthians. He also took away 2,000 talents, which Pompey had not touched, but when he had passed over the Euphrates, he perished himself. and his army with him, concerning which affairs this is not the proper time to speak. In other words, Crassus, thinking himself, oh, I'm the governor, I can do whatever I want, decides to invade the temple in Jerusalem. He desecrates it, goes into the holy treasury, steals the money and the golden elements that were placed in the temple, and uses them to finance his war against Parthia. But since he is so arrogant, he decides to invade Parthia with these funds the year later, in the year 53 BC. One of his followers, Cassius, tells him not to be so arrogant and to not act that way. That he needed to plan things better. But Crassus, since he was a governor, he was full of arrogance. He was so full of himself, saying, I'm the governor here. Who are you to tell me what to do? I lead this army. I make the decisions. So Crassus was also full of himself. He refused to listen to Cassius. And as the Bible tells us, a haughty spirit, a proud spirit goes before a fall. Crassus, full of arrogance, crosses over the Euphrates, and once he enters the area known as Carrhae, which is today the border between Syria and Turkey, once he is in that region, Crassus is exterminated with a large part of his army. This happens in the year 53 BC. At this time, then, Cassius is elevated to the form of governor of Syria. So now, Scaurus gets replaced Gabinus, Crassus gets replaces Gabinus, and then Cassius replaces Crassus. And now, but Cassius manages to succeed. You see what was going on? The problem with Crassus is that Crassus decided to go straight attack the Parthians head on without a proper plan. Cassius, on the other hand, sets up another plan and lets the Parthians bring the battle to him, and then he has certain systems set up, a certain strategy to destroy the Parthians, because it tells us here that Crassus, but now Cassius after Crassus, so after Cassius replaces Crassus, Cassius is finally able to destroy the Parthians that Crassus was trying to control. So Cassius tells Crassus, don't go over them. Let them come here. Crassus refused. Now Cassius is the governor of Syria. Now Cassius can do whatever strategy he feels fit. The Parthians were marching in order to enter Syria, so the Parthians are attacking Syria. Cassius fled into the province, and when he had taken possession of the same, he made hasty march into Judea. And upon taking Turkey, he carried 30,000 Jews into slavery. So Cassius goes back, takes over a city here in Syria, takes over a part here of Judea, taking Jews prisoner. So he's acting in a particular way. What he tells us, he also slew Pistoleus, who had supported seditious followers of Aristobulus. So Cassius, knowing that the Parthians are invading, goes into Turkey and into Judea and kills each of all the leaders who supported Alexander and Aristobulus. Why? Remember, Aristobulus and Alexander wanted to destroy the Roman forces and to hand the power back to Aristobulus, or in this case, his son, Alexander. Now, this being the case, and we see that Cassius is getting rid of those who might join forces with the Parthians. He's making sure that there's nobody around who could betray Roman interests and switch sides to Parthia. Now, Now let's see what it continues. And it was Antipater who advised him to do so. So Antipater, Herod's son, tells him, hey, kill all those who were fighting against Gabinus. Because if they were fighting against Gabinus, who knows, they might join the Parthians against you. Cassius says, you're right. So that, he cuts off all those who could potentially betray Cassius, and Cassius rewards Antipater by letting him marry an Nabatean princess called Cyprus. Married him. That's why it says here, and it was Antipater who advised him to do so. Now, this Antipater married a wife of an eminent family among the Arabisus, among the Arabs, among the Nabateans, whose name was Cyprus. This Cyprus gives Antipater 4 sons named Herod, Phasaelis, Joseph, and there's another name I'm trying to remember, but I cannot remember at the moment. Pheroras, and a daughter called the daughter was Salome. He tells us the name here later on, whose name was Cyprus, and 4 sons were born by him to him by her, Phasaelis and Herod, who was afterward king. And besides this, Joseph and Pheroras, and he had a daughter whose name was Salome. So these are the 5 kids that Cyprus had. So Herod had 3 brothers, Joseph, Pheroras, and Phasaelis, and a sister called Salome. Now, as he made himself friends among the men of power everywhere, by the kinds of offices he did them, and the hospitable manner that he treated them, so that he contacted the great friendship with the king of Arabia by marrying his relation. You see what Antipater is doing here. He becomes friend of Rome by supporting Cassius, Gabinus, and so forth. He becomes friends of the Nabateans, who would have been enemies of Rome, by marrying Arab princes. And he does, so now he's becoming, through all this politicizing, he becomes very influential among all the other people. And then he continues telling us, he forced Alexander to come to terms and to be quiet. He returned to Euphrates in order to prevent the Parthians from repassing it, concerning which matter we shall speak elsewhere. So now, under Antipater's suggestion, Antipater has already made sure to put everything in place. He has gotten the enemies of the state to be killed, and those who could potentially fall in line with him, he started negotiating to get friends all over the place. So now Antipater is in a very powerful position. Militarily, he has the support of Rome. Politically, he has the support of the Arabs. And his daughter Salome marries into a Greek family that was living in Egypt. So now everything is in place now, so that Rome rises up. We're going to stop right here because it's the end of chapter 8. And in a future time, we will read chapter 9. Today, like always, let me finish by saying and proclaiming this: Long live Christ the King!